A man silently stands up, picks up his old leather briefcase, and walks past the rows of seats with a calm look in his eyes. No one speaks, no one stops him, no words of apology are uttered, only awkward glances, late bows of the head, and a woman once confident in controlling the entire cabin, now standing frozen, witnessing the man she had dismissed with an unconscious bias. He didn't need to shout, he didn't need to argue. With silence, he made the entire world listen. What happened on that seemingly ordinary flight? Why did a seemingly small decision end up changing the fates of two people forever? Join me in the story, The Power of Silence, a tale that will make you reflect on prejudice, self-respect, and the choice between silence and resistance. If you love impactful and meaningful stories like this, don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe to the channel to join us on these heart-touching journeys. The flight attendant accused a black judge of being dishonest, and with just one phone call, she lost her job immediately. Solomon Pierce boarded the plane like any other passenger, wearing a neatly tailored navy blue suit and shiny leather shoes. His composed appearance and calm demeanor quickly caught the attention of a few people in the cabin, though he seemed oblivious to it. His right hand tightly gripped an old leather briefcase, while his left held a folded boarding pass. He was a seasoned federal judge, respected in the legal community for his sharp mind and fair judgments. Not in a hurry, Solomon walked toward seat 1A in the first-class cabin, nodding politely to the flight attendant at the door before settling in. He carefully tucked the briefcase under the seat, fastened his seatbelt, and pulled out a thin book of poetry from his jacket pocket. Ignoring his phone and the surrounding passengers, he quietly read the book, flipping through the pages with a steady rhythm, exuding patience and tranquility. In another part of the cabin, Raina Marlowe, the head flight attendant, was conducting her usual cabin check with her signature professionalism. Her uniform was immaculate, and her posture was as straight as a soldier's, her sharp gaze scanning each passenger as if she were scrutinizing them. As she entered the first-class cabin, Raina's eyes quickly scanned the familiar faces of business people until they stopped on Solomon. She hesitated for a moment, the polite expression on her face cracking slightly, but she quickly regained her composure, adjusted her uniform, and walked straight to seat 1. "Excuse me, sir," she said loudly enough for several passengers nearby to glance over. "May, I see your boarding pass." Solomon looked up, slightly surprised but entirely composed. He handed her the boarding pass without hesitation. Raina took it, staring intently at the line, reading Seat 1A, blinking slowly. "This pass clearly states Seat 1A, she emphasized, as if explaining something complicated. "This is first class, yes." Solomon replied, his voice calm. Raina glanced back at the boarding pass, then at his face, then back at the ticket. She hesitated. "Are you sure there's no mistake? Perhaps your company." Solomon shook his head, confirming there was no error. Raina's voice suddenly turned firm. "Sir, I must ask you to move to economy class. We can sort this out later, but right now I need you to vacate this seat." The entire cabin went silent. A few passengers turned their heads in curiosity. A woman lowered her magazine and observed closely. Solomon closed the book, slowly tucked the boarding pass into his jacket pocket. Without arguing or saying another word, he calmly stood up, grabbed his briefcase, and walked toward the back of the plane. His gaze straight ahead, jaw clenched. Raina stepped aside, her arms crossed in front of her chest. As Solomon walked by, she exhaled lightly, as if relieved to have extinguished a small issue. Solomon reached the last row of seats, found an empty spot by the window, placed his bag under the seat, and sat down. He took out his phone and quickly typed a short message. Asked to leave first-class ticket, not honored, no explanation. After sending it, the phone screen went dark. Solomon glanced down at his hand for a moment, then turned his gaze out the small window next to him, his expression still calm. What Raina didn't know was that the man she had just publicly humiliated was not an ordinary passenger. A phone call had just been made, and it could bring everything she had built crashing down. Back in the first-class cabin, Raina continued serving drinks, greeting passengers, with a bright smile, treating the earlier incident as just a minor inconvenience that had been resolved. She didn't notice that several passengers around her were exchanging worried glances, whispering to each other, or pretending to read their magazines, their eyes sneaking glances toward Solomon. A quiet sense of unease began to spread through the cabin, faint as mist but cold, signaling that this issue would not end here. At the back of the plane, Solomon Pierce sat quietly, his long legs slightly curled up in the cramped space of the economy seat. He did not complain or sigh, simply sitting in silence, with his hand resting on the armrest, his face almost expressionless. But beneath that calm exterior, Solomon's mind was in turmoil. He was not angry, but disappointed by how easily the insult had occurred, and even more so by Raina Marlowe's casual attitude when she pushed him down to the back seat without a second thought. His phone buzzed and a brief message appeared on the screen. "Who made you leave?" "Which airline?" Solomon typed his reply with careful precision. "Flight 714. Horizon Air. Head flight attendant Raina Marlowe." There was no reply, nor did he expect one. The person on the other end had all the information they needed. A few rows ahead, Lyra Vance, a young flight attendant, was moving toward the galley to fetch more drinks. As she passed Raina, she hesitated for a moment before softly saying, "Hey, that man, I clearly saw his ticket when he boarded." It said seat 1A. Raina didn't bother looking up, responding coldly, "I know what I saw." Then she added firmly, "It could be a system error, or he was mistakenly upgraded." Lyra hesitated for a moment, but ultimately chose not to argue. Raina seemed very confident in her beliefs. Turning to Lyra, Raina lowered her voice but spoke with authority. "Lyra, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I can tell right away when someone doesn't belong. Trust me, if he really had a valid ticket, he would have defended himself. Don't make a fuss about this." "Okay." Lyra nodded quietly, her face showing concern, then turned away. Meanwhile, Raina continued her work in first class with a bright smile, chatting cheerfully with the passengers. She was completely unaware that down on the ground, in a secret operations room at Horizon, air alarm signals had already been triggered. An urgent call had been made. Get in touch with the captain immediately. In the cockpit, Captain Orion Blake was reviewing flight data when he noticed the internal phone light blinking. Normally, these were just routine updates, but this time the voice on the other end was fast and urgent. "Captain Blake, this is Asher Quinn from Horizon Air's emergency response team." Asher's voice came through. "We've just received a report about a passenger in first class being wrongly asked to move. His name is Solomon Pierce." Captain Blake paused, the name familiar. A renowned federal judge, someone who had worked with the Aviation Oversight Committee. "He has a valid ticket for seat 1A. Asher continued, his tone tense, but the head flight attendant ordered him to leave without any legitimate reason. The cockpit fell into silence. The co-pilot glanced at Captain Blake, looking confused. A cold shiver ran down Captain Blake's spine. "We haven't received any information about this issue," Captain Blake said cautiously. "Well, now you know," Asher replied firmly. "We need you to immediately verify this with the head flight attendant. Judge Pierce has contacted his office, and legal teams are getting involved. The CEO has been informed. Treat this as a crisis situation." Captain Blake swallowed hard, sensing the gravity of the situation. He ended the call, gently set the phone down, and slowly activated the internal microphone. His voice echoed throughout the plane, calm but slightly tense. "Head flight attendant Raina Marlowe, please report to the cockpit." Upon hearing the announcement, Raina froze. Being called to the cockpit mid-flight was always a sign of something serious. She adjusted her uniform, smoothed her hair, and hurried toward the front, the sound of her heels echoing lightly on the carpet. When she entered the cockpit, Captain Blake stared at her, his gaze heavy. "Raina," he began, I've just received information from the operations department. Did you ask a passenger to leave? Seat 1A? Raina blinked briefly, surprised. Yes, there was a man sitting there. I checked the ticket, but he didn't look like a first-class passenger. Captain Blake's voice turned cold. You made a judgment. Raina felt her throat dry. The captain continued, each word weighing heavily. That man is Judge Solomon Pierce. You removed a federal judge from first class without cause. Legal teams have intervened. The executive board is monitoring this flight in real time. Raina's stomach tightened. I didn't know, she stammered. That's the problem, Captain Blake responded sharply. You should have known. You have the ticket in hand. You have the passenger list. Raina's voice dropped to almost a whisper. What should I do now? Captain Blake paused for a moment, then said, You need to fix this right now. Raina turned, her heart pounding, trying to maintain composure as she walked back to the cabin. But each step felt heavy. I would like to invite you back to your first-class seat. Solomon turned his head, slowly, his gaze calm but unreadable. He didn't respond immediately, causing Raina's smile to twist awkwardly. I apologize for the inconvenience, she hastily added, her tone sounding more like a rehearsed line than genuine sincerity. Solomon held his gaze on her face for a few moments before speaking, his voice calm but sharp. A misunderstanding. You say? Raina nodded quickly. A bit clumsy? Yes, just a mistake, not intentional. Solomon raised one eyebrow, his eyes cold. You held my ticket, you read my name, you saw my seat number, so what made you unsure? The air around them thickened. A few passengers poked their heads out from their seats. Others pretended to read books or fiddle with their phones, but their eyes betrayed their curiosity. Raina felt a flush of heat on her face. Ah, she stammered, then fell silent. Solomon continued, his voice unchanged. You didn't check anyone else in first class, just me. Why is that? Raina opened her mouth as if to say something, but closed it again, in silence. The silence was heavier than any excuse. Solomon slowly stood up, grabbed his leather briefcase, and walked down the aisle with a terrifying calmness. Let's go. He said, his voice light as wind, but carrying a weight that made Raina feel small in her own uniform. The short walk back to first class suddenly felt like a long, drawn-out journey. The looks from either side of the aisle were no longer indifferent. They were sharp, cold, even accusatory. Some people even leaned out to take a closer look. Solomon remained silent the entire way, showing no emotion. When he reached seat 1A, he calmly placed his bag under the seat, fastened his seatbelt, and opened his old book again, as if nothing had happened. Raina stood there hesitating, unsure of what to say next. Finally, she muttered, If you need anything else, please let me know. Solomon didn't look at her. He flipped a page of the book, his eyes fixed on the words, completely ignored. Raina turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last. She felt the eyes of all the passengers like needles piercing her back. Back in the galley, Raina was no longer the same person she had been when the flight took off. Her shoulders slumped, her movements fumbled as she arranged the cups, though everything around her was perfectly in place, needing no adjustment from her. In her career as a flight attendant, Raina had encountered all types of passengers, from the hot-headed to the rude. But Solomon Pierce was different. He didn't get angry, he didn't shout. He was just silent. A silence so full of pride that it made her feel as though she was exposing herself under the gaze of the entire cabin. Up front in the plane, Solomon sat lost in thought. His book was still open on his lap, but his eyes had stopped reading long ago. He was thinking about how a single moment of unconscious bias could tarnish a lifetime of building a career based on justice and honor. A soft buzz interrupted his thoughts. Solomon glanced at his phone. Internal investigation opened. CEO has been notified. Action will be taken upon landing. He read the message, nodded slightly, then placed his phone face down on the table, returning to his calm sitting posture. This wasn't a fight driven by anger or revenge. For Solomon, this was a matter of principle. A few passengers adjusted their seating. Some glanced at him with quiet gratitude. Others avoided his gaze, filled with guilt. They all understood what they had witnessed, and they knew they had chosen silence. In the galley, Raina Marlowe stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the cold metal wall. She was completely unaware that hundreds of miles away in an office, her personnel file had just been pulled from the archive. She didn't know that Horizon Air's legal and PR teams had already begun drafting an emergency statement. All she could feel now was the complete evaporation of power and control things she had once believed were firmly in her hands. What was most frightening was not a single mistake. It was the deeper reason behind that mistake. Time in the cabin seemed to stand still. The familiar hum of the engines was drowned out by the oppressive atmosphere, with quick glances and fragmented whispers. Everyone could feel it. Something very serious had just happened, but no one dared to speak. In seat A, Solomon Pierce sat motionless, his face still maintaining its calm, but around him the air seemed to thicken, heavy with tension. Those who had previously ignored him now occasionally glanced at him furtively. Some carried looks of guilt, others curiosity, but no one dared to meet his gaze for long. A middle-aged man wearing a gray blazer and noise-canceling headphones quietly removed the headphones, slightly leaned toward Solomon, and cleared his throat as if preparing to speak. I saw what happened. The middle-aged man wearing a gray blazer spoke hesitantly. He lowered his voice as though afraid to break the tense atmosphere that surrounded the cabin. That was unfortunate. Solomon Pierce tilted his head slightly toward him, his gaze calm but sharp. Unfortunate, you say, he repeated, not showing any sign of annoyance, but with a clear underlying implication. The man shifted uncomfortably, stammering. What I mean is, clearly it was a mistake. Solomon raised an eyebrow, repeating, a mistake, the man faltered, or maybe just a misunderstanding. Solomon didn't reply. He fell silent, and it was that very silence that thickened the air between them. An unspoken truth had been confirmed. Meanwhile, Raina Marlowe stood quietly behind the partition, her heart pounding in her chest. Just moments ago, she had been confident in her control over everything. Now the averted glances and the suffocating atmosphere of the cabin made her feel smaller than ever. Nova Lane, the young flight attendant, stood quietly nearby. She had witnessed everything from the moment Solomon was asked to leave his seat to Raina's awkward apology. The air around them seemed frozen. Even the sound of the airplane engine seemed distant and detached. Finally, Nova broke the silence with a soft question. Are you okay? Raina didn't look up, her response terse. I'm fine. Nova shook her head gently. Doesn't look like it. I'm fine. Raina repeated, this time more sharply, making her regret it almost immediately. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, took a deep breath, then softened her tone. I just need to get through this flight. Nova looked at her for a few seconds more, then leaned in closer, lowering her voice. You know who he is, right? Raina looked up, her eyes tired. I know he didn't insult you. No shouting, just silence. Nova's voice was low but firm. It's that silence that truly makes people afraid. Raina didn't respond. She poured herself a glass of water, her hands still trembling. No more words were needed. In seat 1A, Solomon Pierce received another brief message. CEO has been notified. Action will be taken upon landing. Prepare for an official apology and a full review of the crew. He exhaled softly through his nose, his gaze still calm. He wasn't looking for a scene, nor did he need revenge. What he was waiting for was justice. Solomon glanced at the curtain where Raina had just disappeared. The curtain remained still, but he knew behind it a storm of emotions was brewing. And Raina, by instinct, had also sensed it, that her mistake wasn't just a small incident, but a turning point she couldn't undo. The sound of the engines continued to hum steadily, but the atmosphere inside the cabin had completely changed. It wasn't just the heavy silence of the crew or the hushed conversations being abruptly cut off. It was the underlying tension creeping through every glance, every adjustment in posture. In the cockpit, Captain Orion Blake sat carefully reviewing the flight data, but his focus was no longer complete. In his more than 20 years flying across the skies, he had witnessed unruly passengers, sudden incidents, even scandals that had made the headlines. But this time it was different. It wasn't simply a passenger being moved. It was the identity of that passenger and the way a person of power could still be treated like a stranger, all based on a prejudiced glance. The internal phone rang again. Captain Blake quickly picked it up. Captain Blake came the decisive voice from the operations team on the other end. The CEO has approved the investigation of the flight crew as soon as the plane lands. A private vehicle will pick up Judge Pierce at the gate, and airport security will escort the head flight attendant for questioning. The voice on the other end was slow but heavy. You are required to be completely transparent. No delays or concealment of any details. Captain Blake nodded slowly, feeling the weight of what was to come. Captain Orion. Blake ended the call, gently placed the receiver down, and rested his hand on his chin, his eyes deep in thought. A heavy sense of foreboding quietly took over his mind. He knew without a doubt that this flight would not be one that people could easily forget. In the galley, Rena Marlowe stood motionless, her gaze vacant as it fixated on the drawer containing the food trays which she had neglected for more than 10 minutes. She could feel Nova Lane standing silently behind her, like a shadow quietly watching. They just called up to the cockpit again. Nova broke the silence. Her voice light, but enough to add tension to the air. Did they say anything to you? Rena didn't turn around, standing still, her entire body tense. Something was quietly dismantling the world she once believed was stable. Slowly, she turned to face Nova, her voice small. I know. Nova paused for a few seconds before speaking again. You better think carefully about what you'll say when the plane lands. It was just a mistake, Rena replied, clenching her jaw tightly. Nova raised an eyebrow, her gaze unyielding. Really? Rena fell silent. Even though she wanted to deny it, she couldn't. Deep down, she knew this wasn't just a temporary mistake. It was the result of years of unconscious biases, assumptions she had never faced head-on. Over the years, she had trusted her instincts, believing that her sensitivity would always guide her to the right place. But today it was that very instinct that had led her into disaster, starting from the moment she asked Solomon Pierce to leave his seat. In seat, yay. Solomon Pierce received another brief message. This time it was from a familiar name, a colleague on the Judicial Ethics Board. The message was short and to the point official letter sent to the airline's board of directors. Maintain your composure. Solomon hadn't asked for that, but he understood sometimes. True respect comes without asking for it. At the same time, whispers began to spread across the cabin like small waves. A woman leaned in close to her companion and whispered, I think that's the guy who was moved to economy earlier. Now he's back in first class. Yeah, the flight attendant seemed weird. Something's definitely going on. These quiet murmurs quickly spread through the cabin, weaving through the rows of seats, making the atmosphere feel even heavier with each passing minute. In the galley, Rena gripped the edge of the counter tightly, her knuckles turning white from the force. For years, she had built her reputation as a sharp, disciplined head flight attendant who maintained absolute control. But today, that control had betrayed her. Suddenly, Rena turned to Nova, her voice hollow. I need some time. Without waiting for a reply, she quickly rushed through the curtain, her steps stiff as she made her way down the aisle. A few passengers looked up as she passed by, but Rena kept her head down, hoping to blend into the crowd. For the first time in her career, she wished she could disappear. Entering the restroom, Raina locked the door, leaning against the sink. The cold fluorescent light cast a harsh glow, making her face in the mirror look a decade older. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her lips were pressed tightly together, as if trying to contain her fear. She splashed cold water on her face, gripping the edge of the sink to keep from collapsing. The fear inside her wasn't just about losing her job. It was deeper. The feeling that this mistake, this harm, had been permanently exposed. No report, no apology could erase it. A man had been unjustly stripped of his rightful seat, all because of an unconscious prejudiced glance. And instead of reacting with anger, he chose silence, a silence heavier than 1,000 accusations. The seatbelt sign chimed, signaling the plane's descent. Captain Orion Blake's calm voice came over the intercom, announcing preparations for landing. But for many in the cabin, that announcement passed by like a distant sound, lost in the thick atmosphere. Raina adjusted her hair, stepping out of the restroom, not bothering to look in the mirror again. She trudged back to the galley, her eyes no longer searching for support. The glances she felt, whether avoided or quietly met, made her realize one thing: she was no longer invisible. Nova Lane stood there, still silently observing, as Raina hurriedly grabbed a stack of entry cards, her hands trembling. Trying to maintain her usual habits of issuing cards and tidying up now for Raina, it all felt like a fragile mask, hiding a truth that could no longer be saved. In seat 1D, Solomon. Pierce calmly fastened his seatbelt neatly, folding his book of poetry and placing it in the seat back pocket. He leaned back in his chair, relaxed as if nothing had happened. The small phone on the table buzzed once again. A new message appeared. Security will be at the gate. Solomon unlocked the screen, his hands resting neatly on his lap, ready for whatever was to come next. The first to be escorted, the final message appeared on Solomon Pierce's phone screen. A request for an interview had been sent to the airline, but he placed the phone face down on the small table before him, refusing to read any further updates. Across the aisle, the man in the gray blazer who had once awkwardly tried to engage him now shifted uncomfortably, as if trying to get his attention. But then he hesitated, saying nothing more. The conversation that should have happened earlier now remained forever unspoken. In the galley, Raina Marlowe stood motionless, her eyes glued to the safety instruction signs hanging on the wall. Her mind was spinning, imagining all the worst-case scenarios that might unfold. Throughout her career, she had been used to sitting down and writing reports about passengers. But now, for the first time, she was the subject of a report she couldn't control. Raina, Nova Lane's soft voice broke through from behind. We're preparing to land. You should sit down and rest for a bit. Raina turned around, surprised by the gentleness in Nova's tone, but that kindness only made her feel weaker. I'll wait, Raina whispered, just a few more minutes. In the cockpit, Captain Orion Blake focused on the landing procedures, but his mind lingered on the messages from the operations team. High alert media risk request for direct monitoring. He fully understood the significance of every action at this point. An official statement would soon be issued, and perhaps within hours, Solomon Pierce's name would be everywhere in the news. Through the thin clouds, the runway began to appear in the distance. The plane descended smoothly, but instead of the usual reassurance, there was only a heavy weight in the cabin. Solomon Pierce adjusted his suit jacket and glanced out the window. His expression remained unchanged, but deep inside, he knew this moment had shaken a part of his life forever. He had been dismissed, overlooked simply because of prejudice. And it wasn't until he quietly sent a message that things began to be acknowledged. At the back, Raina Marlowe stood still in the galley, her hands clasped tightly together as the plane came to a stop at the gate. The sound of the hydraulic brakes squealed lightly, then the engines gradually wound down. A familiar announcement came over the loudspeakers. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off. Thank you for flying with us. Captain Orion Blake's voice still carried its steady tone, but there was an edge of seriousness to it that was not there before. No one stood up. All the passengers seemed to understand, as if they knew something was about to happen, and it wouldn't be ordinary. Raina glanced toward the cockpit, waiting for a signal, but there was nothing. Everything was drowned in silence. Then the airplane door opened. With a hiss, the sound of the pressurized air releasing into the cabin. The first person to enter was a man in a black suit. No airline insignia, no name tag, but his gaze was sharp, serious. Following him was a security officer wearing a belt with an ID badge and a communication earpiece. Finally, an internal affairs officer with a silver nameplate reading Internal Affairs. Horizon Air. Raina's stomach tightened as if an invisible hand were squeezing her. The man in the black suit nodded to Captain Blake, then turned to Nova Lane. "We have 2 tasks," he said, in a low, clear voice. "First, escort Mr. Pierce. Then work with the head flight attendant." Nova nodded, her face expressionless. The security officer moved straight toward seat 1A. Every passenger in the aisle watched, no longer pretending to be unaware of what was happening. Some leaned forward to get a better look. Others whispered quietly. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Solomon Pierce had already packed his belongings. His briefcase was securely closed, his suit jacket buttoned. When the security officer approached, he stood up and nodded politely. The officer spoke softly. "Sir, we're ready." Without another word, Solomon rose from his seat, his composure unwavering, and followed the group toward the exit. Solomon. Pierce briefly scanned the cabin. The passengers who had turned their backs whispered or pretended not to notice. Now silently met his gaze. No one spoke as he stood gripping his leather briefcase, firmly, walking steadily toward the door. A few people lowered their heads. One woman whispered. He handled this with such calm. The airplane door swung open to greet him. And at that moment, Raina Marlowe instinctively took a step forward, her lips barely moving as though she wanted to say something. But Solomon didn't glance at her. He walked straight out, leaving behind a silence that resonated more than any defense could. The man in the black suit turned to Nova Lane and gently issued his command. "Now we need to meet with Flight Attendant Marlowe." Raina felt her body freeze. Her legs seemed glued to the floor. Nova simply stood silently, then stepped back to make way. The internal affairs officer raised a tablet and spoke in a firm but polite tone. "Ms. Marlowe, please bring your ID and staff card. We will escort you to the investigation room for a preliminary session." Raina nodded faintly, taking heavy steps as if walking on stone. As she passed through the curtain leading to the main cabin, she immediately sensed the shift in the passengers' gazes. No more respectful glances, only silent, judgmental looks. Reaching, seat, J, now empty. Raina paused for a moment. She looked at the headrest still marked by the imprint of the man she had tried to push out of his rightful seat. She quickly averted her eyes and continued walking forward. Outside, Solomon Pierce faced 2 senior executives from Horizon Air. One of them stepped forward, extending a hand. "Mr. Pierce, on behalf of the entire company, we sincerely apologize." Solomon hesitated for a moment before shaking hands, feeling the firm grip. The manager continued, "We've already initiated an internal investigation. Measures are being taken. This will not be overlooked." Solomon looked directly into the eyes of the person in front of him, then slowly replied, "This is not just about me." The manager nodded, his expression stern. "We understand." Solomon glanced out the window. The airplane he had just stepped off was still parked, its nose pointing toward the terminal, as if unaware of the media storm waiting to unfold. Meanwhile, Raina Marlowe was escorted off the plane. As soon as she stepped into the terminal hall, the flash of cameras erupted like a storm, followed by a barrage of questions. "Did you ask a federal judge to leave his first-class seat? Are you aware of the discriminatory nature of your actions? Do you know who he is?" Raina recoiled from the wave of questions, not responding a word, only lowering her head and walking quickly down the hallway. She knew very well by tomorrow morning her name would be everywhere in the headlines. And what terrified her the most wasn't just losing her job. It was the fact that everyone would now see what she had tried to hide behind the facade of her uniform and rigid procedures. In a single moment of bias, she had exposed her true self. The familiar sounds of the terminal echoed around her, the rolling of luggage, the loudspeakers calling out flights, the laughter and cries of children. But outside Gate 6B, a different scene was unfolding. A small crowd had gathered near the glass area overlooking the jet bridge, murmuring small talk. Everyone was paying close attention to the movements of the group just disembarking from the plane. Phones were raised, capturing every moment. Security officers appeared standing between the crowd, quietly maintaining order. Solomon Pierce stepped out of the checkpoint, surrounded by a small group of Horizon Air executives and legal advisors. A few people tried to engage with him, but Solomon only nodded or responded with brief, polite words. He wasn't interested in the apologies offered under public pressure. He was too familiar with that. A tall female executive, dressed in a sharp suit, tightly clutching a file folder, spoke up. Judge Pierce, we've officially launched an internal investigation. The head flight attendant, Marlowe, is being questioned as we speak. Your office will be updated as soon as there are results. Solomon merely nodded his gaze, once again turning outward. Through the glass, he watched as the passengers disembarked, blending into the fast-paced life of the airport. Some people recognized him, giving a slight nod of acknowledgement. Others hurriedly turned away. Behind him, a media officer approached, lowering their voice to ask, "Sir, we plan to release a press statement, if possible. May we include a quote from you?" Solomon didn't turn around, simply answering briefly, "Not yet." The media officer nodded and quietly withdrew. In a small meeting room deep within the terminal, Raina Marlowe sat alone at a long table. She placed her staff card neatly in front of her, a silent confession that didn't need to be spoken. Her hands were tightly intertwined, her gaze vacant as she stared into space. The room was cold with pristine white walls and the harsh fluorescent lighting, no windows in sight. On the opposite wall, the Horizon Air logo appeared on a flat screen, soft but carrying a cold, impersonal aura. The ticking of the wall clock punctuated the tense atmosphere. Each tick felt like a strike in the silence. Raina Marlowe had been sitting there for 17 minutes, and no one had come in. Her palms were damp with sweat, and the hem of her uniform skirt had been wiped twice. Finally, 2 people entered, a human resources officer and a legal officer. The man from the legal department, Robert Clean, with his stern face, placed the tablet on the table and switched on the recording device. A small red light blinked on flight attendant Marlowe. Roberts' voice was steady. "This is the official investigation regarding the incident on Flight 714, where you requested passenger Solomon Pierce to vacate his first-class seat. Can you confirm that this occurred?" Raina swallowed hard, her throat dry, her voice faltering far. Robert continued, his expression unreadable. "Did you check his boarding pass before asking him to leave his seat?" "I checked," Raina answered softly, hesitating, "but I suspected it wasn't valid." Robert didn't budge. Based on what Raina faltered, he didn't look like a first-class passenger. "You mean based on his appearance?" Robert asked, his tone unchanged. A long silence followed. Raina remained silent. Robert's voice became firmer. "Let me emphasize. You asked a federal judge to leave a valid seat he had purchased. You did this without following the verification process, without asking the gate agent or checking the passenger list. It was all based on subjective judgment and resulted in a public humiliation in front of over 30 passengers." Raina stammered, "I didn't know who he was." "That's not the issue," Robert replied bluntly. "The issue is that you decided who was worthy based solely on appearances." Raina's eyes reddened. She blinked rapidly to prevent tears from spilling. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that everything had happened so fast that she was only acting out of a sense of responsibility, but no words came out. She was completely powerless. The human resources officer, a woman with a calm gaze, looked up from her scribbled notes. Flight Attendant Marlowe, this isn't just a procedural error. This is a serious incident that affects the company's reputation and public trust. Although Judge Pierce has not officially filed a lawsuit, a discrimination complaint has been sent to the company's ethics board. The woman paused, her voice softening, but still firm. We are considering the highest level of disciplinary action, including termination. Raina closed her eyes. A decade of effort, flawless flights, excellent performance reviews, all now reduced to a few cold lines on an investigation report. It had all shattered because of an irreversible wrong choice. Now, Raina suddenly spoke, her voice breaking. Can I speak to him? Robert shook his head decisively. That's not within our jurisdiction. In the designated waiting area, Solomon Pierce sat quietly. In front of him was just a glass of water and his phone lying face down. He had declined all interview requests, refused the ride home or hotel arranged by the airline. He wasn't seeking special treatment. What he needed was acknowledgement from those who had witnessed, but chose silence. From the flight crew to the passengers, all had chosen safety for themselves instead of justice. His phone buzzed lightly, a message from his court assistant. The public statement from Horizon Air is expected to be released within 2 hours. The communications team is awaiting your input. He read the message for a long moment, then replied, Remind them this isn't about me. This is the consequence when power is confused with prejudice. Solomon placed his phone face down again. Though Raina Marlowe had once advanced faster than many of her colleagues, receiving countless accolades for her competence and composure, she now realized that all of those achievements no longer mattered. The most valuable thing she had, the fair judgment she had always trusted, had now betrayed her. On the other side of the airport, in the executive lounge, Solomon Pierce sat in silence. The glass of water on the table remained untouched, his phone face down and the leather briefcase resting by his chair. He chose solitude. His assistant had offered to stay with him, but he declined. He only wanted some peace, a moment of quiet to breathe. He wasn't angry. For Solomon, anger was a fleeting emotion, quickly passing and solving nothing. What he felt now was a burden much heavier. He had faced prejudice his entire life, but this time the feeling had struck deep within. It wasn't because he was asked to leave first class. It wasn't because of the glances or whispers. It was because Raina Marlowe had looked at him and hastily passed judgment, not based on protocol, not based on the facts, but solely based on prejudice. She hadn't seen a man with a valid first-class ticket. She had only seen someone who didn't belong there. And that, more than any insult, wounded Solomon deeply. A soft vibration on the table. He looked down. A call from Eleanor Brooks. Solomon picked up the phone. On the other end, a calm but determined voice came through. Solomon, I've received the report. This is already spreading. Solomon nodded, as he had expected. I've had 3 calls from the news stations. Eleanor continued, They want a statement from you. Solomon exhaled slowly through his nose, accepting the reality. After a brief pause, Eleanor's voice grew somber. You've handled the situation wonderfully. Many would have lost their temper, but you didn't. Solomon gave a faint, empty smile. For what purpose? Just to give them more reason to reject you. Eleanor replied, You chose silence, and that silence is what terrifies them. Solomon nodded, though he knew Eleanor couldn't see. Keep me updated, of course, Eleanor replied. And Solomon, this isn't just about a flight or an airline. It's about what's called human dignity, something people often forget until someone forces them to remember. The call ended. Solomon sat still for a moment before standing up and gathering his things. He didn't need anyone to guide him. Life's experiences had taught him that at times one must simply move forward alone. In the investigation room, Raina Marlowe jumped slightly when she saw Robert Clean return, holding a printed file and a sealed envelope. Temporarily, you are prohibited from performing any duties entering the company premises or contacting passengers from Flight 714. Raina remained silent, neither protesting nor showing surprise. Robert slid the envelope across the table toward her. These are the terms of your suspension. You may review them later. Raina's voice was weak as she asked, "Can I speak to him?" Robert paused for a moment before replying. "That is not within our authority, and he hasn't requested to speak with you." Raina nodded, blinking rapidly to hold back the tears that were threatening to spill. She whispered almost to herself, "He didn't shout." Robert leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but sharp. "No, he didn't, and he didn't argue either." He paused for a moment before emphasizing, "And it's that silence that makes everyone unable to forget." Raina felt a deep crack in her soul. It wasn't just the shame of the consequences, but the painful realization that she had hurt a person confidently without considering the full picture. That afternoon, Horizon Air released an official statement. "We acknowledge the incident involving a premium passenger who was treated unfairly by a flight crew member on Flight 714. The airline is conducting a comprehensive internal investigation. Horizon Air is committed to zero tolerance for any form of discrimination." As Horizon tried to manage the public relations crisis, a name began to be mentioned everywhere: Solomon Pierce. He didn't need loud protests. It was his calm silence that revealed truths that no amount of anger could have expressed more clearly. 3 days after Flight 714 landed, the echoes of the event still hadn't died down. The video recording of the entire incident on the flight did not come from Solomon Pierce. It was quietly recorded by a university student sitting in business class who simply felt that something was wrong. The student had no intention of creating a viral moment. She simply opened her phone and started recording. The clip lasted only 48 seconds. It captured the moment when Raina Marlowe insisted that Mr. Pierce leave his first-class seat. The absolute silence, as he stood up in his quiet walk down the aisle, without a word of complaint, without any argument. It was that silence captured in the shaky lens of a phone that attracted over 4 million views within just 2 days, causing both major and minor news outlets to report on it. The headlines varied slightly, but the message remained the same. A federal judge was forced to vacate his first-class seat, despite holding a valid ticket raising concerns about discrimination in the airline industry. A media storm erupted around Flight 714. Television programs debated fiercely. Aviation experts dissected the process, and legal analysts pointed out deeper systemic issues. But for Solomon Pierce, all the external chaos meant little. He declined interviews kept away from the crowds and only attended 2 closed-door meetings, one with Horizon Air's legal team and one with the airline's ethics board. In those meetings, he spoke clearly and calmly without anger or a desire for revenge. He focused only on the truth. When asked about the possibility of a lawsuit, he simply replied, "That depends on how you act when the media spotlight is no longer on you." Meanwhile, Raina Marlowe, once praised for her professionalism, now lived in silence in a small apartment near the airport. Framed certificates and thank you letters from colleagues lined the walls. Now they stood as silent witnesses to a person she wasn't sure she was anymore. Since returning from the hearing, Raina hadn't stepped outside her home. The airline had offered psychological support, but she refused. A media handling guide was sent to her, but she didn't even open it. What tormented her wasn't the disciplinary action. It was the moment when she truly faced herself from the perspective of someone else. She recalled the first look of suspicion when Solomon handed over his boarding pass. She remembered how her voice unconsciously rose, intentionally making the situation more public in front of the crowd. A baseless belief in personal power, an arrogance that pushed her into disaster. It wasn't just a wrong decision. It was the naked revelation of who she had allowed herself to become. On the fourth evening, a thin envelope with no return address appeared at the door of Irina's apartment. Inside was a letter printed from an email forwarded from Solomon Pierce. Subject: responsibility sent to Miss Marlowe. I'm not writing these lines to ask for forgiveness, nor to pass judgment. I'm writing because silence can be a shield or a mirror. You misunderstood my silence as agreement. In reality, it was restraint. I don't need you to express public remorse. What I hope for is for your own sake, not mine, that you ask yourself, what did you really see when you looked at me, and why was that enough for you to act the way you did? Those answers are not meant for any report. They are only meant for you, between you and your conscience. Solomon Pierce. Raina read the letter 3 times, each time slower than the last. She folded it back up carefully, placing it on the kitchen table. No tears, no ripping, and no calling anyone to talk. For the first time since that flight, Raina sat down and stopped defending herself even in her own mind. At the same time, in a peaceful courthouse, 2 states away, Solomon Pierce returned to his office. The secretaries nodded as he passed. Security staff stood a little straighter, as if showing respect. The air in the office now seemed different. A stack of handwritten letters awaited him on his desk from law schools, social organizations, and strangers he had never met. All of them expressed gratitude for how he had handled the situation. Solomon didn't answer them all, but he read each letter because he understood he had never wanted to become a symbol. He simply wanted to be an ordinary passenger sitting quietly in his seat. When that right was taken away, he chose not to react with anger, but with composure, believing that the truth could speak for itself. And indeed, the truth had spoken, not with shouted words, but with silence. In a world accustomed to noisy injustices, it was the silence that resonated the loudest. For most passengers, the incident on Flight 714 was just a passing news story, a trending social media moment that quickly sank into the endless cycle of fleeting outrage. But at the headquarters of Horizon Air, the story was far from over. At the top floor of the sleek glass building that overlooked the city skyline, a closed-door meeting was taking place. Around the long oak table were key figures: the board of directors, legal counsel, communications, human resources, and operations leadership. At the head of the table, Michael Sterling, the CEO of Horizon Air, sat with his hands interlaced, his face stern. In front of him was a thick dossier stamped Flight 714, Full Incident Review. The atmosphere was heavy, as though a storm was about to break. Michael tapped twice on the table. Let's begin. #Sakjar Judge as in 714 is still trending, mostly praising Judge Pierce's composure. But ticket sales in the Northeast region have dropped by 9%. Competitors aren't hesitating to use this opportunity in their ad campaigns. The tension in the room grew palpable. Mr. Pierce refused to give interviews. Drexler asked Monica. The legal director nodded. He only sent a brief statement to the New York Ledger. She read aloud, I'm not seeking attention. My goal is not to punish, but to remind about a quiet failure, the failure to scrutinize bias before acting. I hope this incident becomes a lesson, not just for an airline, but for every boarding gate, every passenger cabin, and everyone in a uniform with the power to determine a passenger's place. The room went silent. Finally, Drexler stood, his voice firm. I want all staff retrained. All of them, from the newest employees to management. Not as a judge, but as a guest speaker for a young leadership program. The audience was made up of high school students, local teachers, and a few parents. He didn't mention the airline, nor did he speak about policies. He simply talked about restraint. From a young age, Solomon began, his voice deep and steady. I was taught that power is not shown by how loudly you speak, but by what you choose not to say. He paused, letting the silence spread across the room. In a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, Raina Marlowe also read those words. The old newspaper was placed at her door, and by habit, she almost didn't open it. But this time she read. She absorbed each line, each word. Afterward, Raina folded the newspaper and placed it next to the envelope containing her termination letter, which she still hadn't dared to open since the other day. No one reached out to her, no colleagues, no superiors, no press. She had been left alone. Raina Marlowe sat alone, repeating the words he had once spoken as if they carried a different weight. With each quiet whisper, power is not in the volume of your voice, but in what you choose not to say. He had paused, letting silence paint a picture clearer than any sound. And today, it was that silence that reflected most clearly the actions people found hard to justify. On the small stage in the auditorium, Solomon Pierce had looked directly at the young faces, eyes wide open, some still confused, while others had begun to grasp the depth of the story. 2 decades sitting as a judge. He continued, I've heard countless people trying to justify moments they could never take back. But what's often most absent in those justifications is a pause followed by 2 words. Taking responsibility. Each word resonated heavier than the gavel strike in a courtroom. Perhaps that was exactly what she needed. For the first time in many years, Raina was forced to sit down and face her true self, the self she had never dared to acknowledge until a man quietly exposed it to the light. And throughout all of it, he never had to raise his voice. That evening, Raina Marlowe stood up for the first time in days. She opened her laptop not to justify herself, not to place blame, not to write a public apology,